Welcome to the Festival of Storytellers.
I can't tell you how excited I am to be on right now. It's been a couple of weeks of excitement, getting prepared, and I've done a lot of things in my life, but this has got to be close to the top.
Thank you, Reader's Magnet, and thank you, John, for putting this forth and taking the chance on us authors in presenting this out to the world.
I've enjoyed this immensely, Joanne.
Ellie, so have I. Thank you for who you are, and thank you, Reader's Magnet. You all are beautiful, and you've worked so very hard, and we are blessed.
We are.
I thank everybody that's involved with this process, because we know writers need readers and writers need publishers. We thank Reader's Magnet and everybody that's involved. I love Reader's Magnet. They say, we share your stories with the world.
Good evening, fairgoers. Welcome to day 13, and welcome to the Festival of Storytellers. I'm Ellie GACCETTA, and welcome to the last session on the next to the last day of what's been a whirlwind 2 weeks. I would like to thank Reader's Magnet for sponsoring this just an exceptional event. And we're live streaming as well on the Reader's Magnet YouTube channel and the Reader's Magnet Facebook page. I am the author of 2 books. My first book is One Caregiver's Journey. This is the book that we will be talking about this evening. And my second book is Generations of Good Food, which is a compilation of 200 recipes from my mother's Italian family, and it spans 6 generations. It's been a lot of fun. You can follow me on Facebook at facebook.com, Ellie GACCETTA. There you go. And you can follow me on Instagram, and my handle there is at ELEANOR GACCETTA. Check out my webpage. It's in my booth where we're streaming from now. And my webpage is onecaregiversjourney.com. Check out my cooking videos. I've got radio interviews. There's just a lot of stuff that's in my webpage, and all of my blogs on caregiving, and I'm starting to put more blogs in on food. Again, as I do every night, if you are a U.S. resident and you would like a copy of my book, please send me your name and address in the contact box here in the booth and on my webpage, and I will be more than happy to send you a copy of my book. So tonight we're going to be kind of venturing into a different territory tonight. And it's something that I write about a lot in One Caregiver's Journey. And it's the emergency room and looking for medical care options. Today, most of the large hospitals, but especially large inner city hospitals and the trauma centers that are in the outskirts of our state anyway, have separate geriatric emergency rooms. So when patients over 65 present themselves to the emergency room, they are sent to this special area for treatment and triage. Frequent visits to the emergency room by the elderly will often result in family being annoyed, family being disappointed, and your loved one and you leaving frequently with no answers as to what happened. And unless it is a major medical issue that is presented to go to the emergency room, you might come away with not a lot of help in knowing what the diagnosis is. Older people have very different needs from the younger people who visit the emergency rooms, both psychologically and physically. Younger people tend to get in accidents, and older people tend to have what they refer to as episodes. My mother had episode after episode. So the first one is, and this is one that is very prevalent, is do not expect to receive a diagnosis. Elderly people will often suffer multiple symptoms at one time. An example might be a mini stroke, and a mini stroke can mimic, they could have several mini strokes in conjunction with one another, one right after another, which will mimic a full-blown stroke. They will have lapses in memory. Sometimes they will just not feel well. They will have pain, but they can't express what it is. And when you're scared out of your wits and you bring them to the emergency room, frequently the emergency room staff, particularly the physicians in the emergency room, will tell you, well, it could be anything. When they see that patient is in their 90s, when they see that patient has a do not resuscitate order in their charts, often they will become less. They will always go through the triage. They will always try to figure out if it's something significant. But because elderly people frequently have pain, anxiety, and occasionally they will actually have a true medical experience. But my mother would get terrible, terrible pains, and we wouldn't know what to do. So I'd either bring her to the hospital, or normally I would call 911. I got to be on first name basis with a lot of the firemen in our area. And they would bring her to the hospital. They would do all the triage. They might run some x-rays, and then sometimes they'd just send her home. But we always had the shrug shoulder diagnosis, as we refer to it. Number 2 is expect your visit to be confusing. Unless there's a true emergency, like a heart attack or a fall or a stroke, expect the treatment to be simplified, even if they're arriving by ambulance. They'll do complementary tests like some x-rays, and often the visits will result in hospitalization, even if a 24-hour observation, because elderly are almost always dehydrated. So sometimes they will say, well, their confusion is because they're dehydrated. Their anxiety is because they're dehydrated. Sometimes these episodes are caused from just whatever. And maybe something occurred in your home that day that caused them to get very uptight and very anxious after it was over. And number 3 is expect that emergency room visit to last a while. Don't think you're going to go right home. In general, and this is not now for the pandemic, but in general, yes, Fairgoer 1928, I did have a lot of ER visits during my caregiving days. And that's why I could tell you that you're going to stay a while. Elderly patients have a longer stay in the emergency department. They require more medical time for medical assessment and nursing care. They return frequently and have a higher frequency of readmission to the hospital. And they usually require a great amount of assistance from the professional staff that are attending to these services. And again, on the other hand, you're going to get that shrug shoulder diagnosis. And they just will say these are episodes. These are episodes. And on number 4, we'll move on to the next slide. Number 4 is expect to be hospitalized. You take into account that emergency services are noisy. When you go into an emergency room, they're noisy. There's a lot of constant movement and motion, and there's a lack of privacy. For an elderly person, this is very disconcerting. It enhances their deterioration in their relationships to hearing, to what they see, to where their attention goes. Their attention bounces around, and what they understand. They just become frazzled to the point of where it's hard to understand them. And the result will lend itself to an enhanced state of confusion. And sometimes they don't get the proper treatment because they're just so annoyed and confused and anxious. They just don't get the proper treatment. So what they will do is hospitalize them, and they will move them to what they call an observation room, which is a general room on a floor. And they can stay for 24 hours. In that 24 hours, they'll load them up with fluid, and they will keep an eye on them. They'll make them get up and move to see if their mobility has been impacted. And generally, the next day, they just send them home. And because they've had so much fluid and they're no longer dehydrated, they are quite often much better. And number 5 is to be Fairgoer 1451 says, I get anxious when I'm in the ER. What more for the elderly? Exactly. I get anxious when I'm in the ER. If I have to visit somebody or take somebody to the ER, you are anxious waiting for them to help you, watching all that's going on, watching everything that's happening around you. Absolutely. Number 5 is the ER health threats. This is certainly something that we have today with the pandemic. When you go to the hospital, everybody's in masks, which also is hard for an elderly person to hear somebody in a mask and understand what they're saying. But if there's a significant health threat, let's say someone presents themselves to the ER with a significant virus, expect to be sent home in short order. Expect to be sent home in short order. They will give you instructions. They will write out orders of how you deal with the problem at home. This happened a couple of times, but one time in particular with my mother, her blood sugar dropped to a very dangerous level. I called 911, and my mother generally went to the emergency room close to midnight. I mean, these things always happened in the dead of night. The firemen would come and you'd be in your pajamas. They'd haul her away, and you'd go change clothes and get in your car and follow the ambulance. She had very, very dangerously low blood sugars. Got her to the hospital. They put her on an IV. In about an hour and a half, she started experiencing some other significant issues. And very abruptly, about 3 a.m, a doctor came in and said, "We have a very serious health threat that just came in. You have to take her home." Now, this is 4 years ago, so this wasn't COVID, because COVID is very rampant in the emergency rooms today. But they sent her home, and her blood sugar had come up just to where it was low normal. It was about between 75 and 80 on the scale. And frankly, I was afraid to bring her home. And so they said, bring her home and don't give her over-the-counter meds for these other issues that she's going through. Just let her go to bed, let it work her out of her system. So we got her home and her other issues started. And it was 4:30 in the morning. And I just decided that I was going to give her some over-the-counter medications so that she would sleep. She was exhausted. And she was not well. And she fell asleep. Actually, we both fell asleep. She fell asleep. And when she woke up, she was much, much better. But there was that threat of a virus, and they sent her home. Expect that to happen at times. And so now I'm going to tell you what my brother and I did to plan her ER visits. On number 6. There you go. My mother would get these episodes generally late at night, and they would last 90 minutes to 2 hours. She would be almost in a state of like she was having a stroke. She could not conceptualize. She had no cognitive abilities. And then after 2 hours, she would be fine. She would be absolutely fine. And that's why we got so many shrugged shoulders, because she just baffled everybody. One evening she was having one of these, and I called my brother, and he said, "I'll be right there." And he said, "Don't call 911. Now, whether this was smart or not is everybody's got an opinion. But we learned that when she had one of these episodes, if she stayed very quiet in bed, and we took turns sitting on the side of the bed, holding her hand, we would reassure her. We would talk very quietly. We would divert the topic and subject to other things. She would always relax and return to normal. She would exhaust herself, and she would fall asleep. The one thing that we were very cognizant not to do during these episodes were to give her any fluids. We didn't want her to choke. We didn't want anything else to happen. So we planned the ER visits, and after that, we really never sent her to the emergency room. She would have an episode, and we would just diligently stay with her and quiet her. And she was in her own home where there was no distractions, no noise, no the lights, the sirens. She was in her familiar surroundings, and she came back. Fairgoer 2185 says, "What do you do if that happened, having something contagious while in the emergency room?" You have to make a choice, particularly at this in now. We were fortunate enough that the one time it happened, they told us and they sent us on our way. They were willing to have her come home rather than to be susceptible to whatever this was. Were the ERs full when the pandemic started is question 2254. The ERs have been loaded since the pandemic started. In Colorado right now, our emergency rooms are overloaded. We are at the highest level of cases since last year. We almost have 1,600 people hospitalized in this state. Many of the emergency rooms, we have FEMA teams in many of the outlying major hospitals, in Pueblo and Fort Collins, Colorado Springs, and Grand Junction on the Western Slope, where they are trauma centers and they don't have sufficient staff. The emergency rooms are full, and they're predominantly full of unvaccinated COVID patients. Excuse me. It's very difficult. It's very difficult for true emergencies to get into the ER. This is not a time in this state where you'd want to have a heart attack. Pardon me. Number seven is look for emergency room options. When my mother would fall, and this is for all of you, if your loved one falls and they are not hurt, and they're saying, just get me up. Well, someone who falls, an elderly person who falls, is dead weight. And unless you can deadlift 400 pounds, you're not going to be able to pick them up. You call 911 and request a lift assist. You request a lift assist. And you let them know that they are not injured. The paramedics will come and they will get them up. They'll either get them in a chair, they'll get them in bed, and they will ensure that they're okay before they leave. Now, sometimes because of their age, the paramedics will want to take them to the emergency room. And it's okay to refuse medical transport. Scare the peewat out of you the first time you do it, because they call the emergency room and tell the head physician that you're refusing transport, and they think the transport is necessary. And if something happens to your loved one because you didn't transport it, it's on you. It's on you. But know full well you will be put on the spot. And particularly that is incredibly traumatic for the caregiver. But I did it. And after I did it the first time and I did it the second time, I was okay. Because I knew she was okay. She would be fine. She would say, I'm not going to no hospital. I'm going to stay right here in my own house. And she would be fine. And again, she would come around and she would be good. I was lucky. 2185 wants to know if we frequently get animal bites in the emergency room. And I would tell you, I don't know, but I would assume certainly. Everybody's walking their dogs. I had a nephew that just recently was bit by a dog. Actually, I had two nephews that were bit by dogs. They were both runners. They're runners, and they were running, and dogs bit them. So neither of them went to the emergency room. They did go to urgent care and get tetanus shots, but they didn't require stitches. So you don't hear a lot about that, but I would imagine they're going to sit for a long time unless it's a really significant bite if they go to the emergency room today in the life and times of COVID. And our final one today is look for some medical options. And I'm going to tell you about what and I've told this story a number of times, but it's significant. I'm going to tell you about what I call my aha moment. Between the ages of 98 and 99, my mother had about 6 months where she was just very sick. And it started with pneumonia. About this time of the year, maybe a little earlier, right after Halloween, she became very ill. She got a cold, and the cold got worse and worse. And I needed my brother's help to get her out of the house and into the doctor's office. She was that sick. They knew immediately that she had pneumonia just listening to her chest. The doctors opted not to send her to the hospital. They opted to send her home so I could take care of her. So she recovered from her pneumonia, but she started having all of these residual complaints. And by springtime, she couldn't hear, her ears hurt. She was miserable. And I was at my wit's end. In one 7-day period, I brought her to urgent care 2 times and to her physician 3 times. And if you've ever had a person who's 99 years old, who is not well, to get them showered, dressed, medicated, fed, out the door into the car, out of the car into the doctor's office, up and down elevators, up and down halls, and then you sit and wait for your turn. And by the 3rd visit to the doctor's office, I'd had it. So when we got home that day, and they just kept saying, well, she has seasonal allergies. And that's also when I learned that elderly people cannot metabolize adult medications for allergies. And I start giving her the children's Motrin. I started giving her children's Zyrtec. And she slowly began to break up all of the mucus in her head, and she slowly got better. But when I was at the absolute end of any rope that anyone would have thrown me, I called a friend of mine that I had worked with who was a social worker at the local hospital-based hospice. I lamented and told her what I had been through, and the first question out of her mouth was, why are you not using the home-based physician service in this area? Who knew? So she gave me the number. I called them, and I called her insurance company, and I was fortunate that they would cover her insurance. Her insurance would cover this service. And for the last 3 years of my mother's life, she never left the couch, not this couch, but she never left a couch. She never left the house for any other medical treatment. This concierge service sent a physician assistant monthly, and I guess you would call it palliative care, but they sent a physician assistant monthly who would check on her. And if she were sick in between, I could call them and they would send either a doctor or the physician assistant would come back. They gave her her flu shots. If she had a urinary tract infection, the mobile lab would come and pick up a specimen. She never needed x-rays, but they also had a mobile x-ray service. And in the same vein, I was able to find an audiologist who would come to the house and service her hearing aids. And it just became so much easier for both of us. So look for medical options. If you get in that kind of a bind, there are options available. We don't have to go crazy. We don't have to go crazy. There are options available for medical care. It is advisable to have someone come in and check on them after a fall. Normally, when a paramedic picks them up, this is to Fairgoer 2251, Normally, when the paramedics pick them up, if they are hurt, they will be able to tell. They will be able to tell. So the paramedics are acutely aware of how to check if they are hurt with the fall. And they knew if they put my mother back in bed and she would start talking to them, and they would carry on a conversation, they would stay for 20, 25, 30 minutes if they had to make sure that she wasn't hurt. But a lift assist is a godsend to a caregiver. Let's go back and recap, Nikki, tonight's Ellie's 8s. Do not expect to receive a diagnosis right away in an emergency room, if at all. Expect your loved one to be confused. It's okay for you to be confused. Expect that emergency room visit to last a while, because even if you go or I go and we're not 99, it's going to last. By the time they get work you through the system and you take your turn, you're going to be there. Expect for your elderly person to be hospitalized, even if it's just for a 24-hour observation. Look for the health threats of viruses or problems that you might, and this is where your ears are good, because sometimes it pays to stand outside the door and observe what's happening in the emergency room, even though it's nuts. Plan your ER visits. You might be able to treat these reoccurring kinds of things yourself very quietly at home. And look for medical options if you need to. Look for medical options if you need to. You're very welcome, Fairgoer 2246. Emergency room visits are things that are just, they're frightening, but they're very much a part of caregiving, and they're very much a part of the elderly. That ends tonight. Don't forget to follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/it's Ellie GACCETTA. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at ELEANOR GACCETTA. Tomorrow I will be hosting tomorrow is day 14. It's the last day of our 2-week Festival of Storytellers. I will be kicking off the day with an author of the hour with James Tenike. And that will be at 9 o'clock in the morning. No, 11 o'clock Eastern, 9 o'clock my time. And catch me at 3 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, when I will be making holiday spiced pecans. And then tomorrow evening, we're going to do a recap, and then we're going to hit on some interesting little topics that people always ask about the elderly, like, do they like music, and what kind of music do they like? What kind of food do they eat? What's in a caregiver's grocery basket? And so that's it, my friends. We've come to the end of day 13. Be safe. Have a good Saturday night. And bye for now.